This is the second volume in my Philip K. Dick box set of novels. As I have mentioned before, these novels are masterful in many different ways, but primarily because of the way they explore the horrors of drug-infused altered states, psychological depression, and just general confusion with identity. So I will go through my thoughts on each of these particular novels, why I think you should read them, because you can buy them separately or you can buy a box set. It's really up to you. So stay tuned. Welcome to biblioCultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Doing these things really helps me out, and thank you again to those that do it. I'm also going to put below my X account where you can speak with me directly, and my Ko-Fi account where you can donate recurringly or a single tip, and also check out the merch store. In this episode, I'm going through the 5 novels of the 60s and 70s by Philip K. Dick. This edition is from Library of America from 2005. And basically, I got a set of all his major novels. Now, there is another set that has the short stories, and that should be good as well, because he was known for doing really good short stories. But this one is for the novels, and this collection organizes them by decades, which I think is cool. If you read them in order, it gives you a good perspective. So this is the second in the box set trilogy. But you can get whichever edition you want, and you can also get these novels independently. I mean, they do stand on their own. So if any of these novels seem interesting to you, then just get that novel. Now, Philip K. Dick in general, to me, is one of the most important writers of the last couple of generations, because he was right there in the middle of the mass experiment of the 60s and 70s with MK Ultra and a lot of drug-infused manipulation of the masses. And he had to suffer the consequences of this horrific experiment. And in many of these novels, he seems to be fully aware that this is the fact. Almost all his works involve some kind of government entity that utilizes drugs in one way or the other to manipulate people, to control, and to destroy people's lives. So he was quite prescient on this, and just for that fact, it is a sociological necessity to understand the time, and I think he encapsulates it perfectly. So I will go through these novels one by one. I will try my best not to spoil them, but I'll just give you some of the philosophical elements or interesting issues that I think merit consideration. So the first one in the set is the Martian Time-Slip, which truly reminded me of Dune, actually, because of the native Martians themselves, the bleak men. There's something similar to the natives in Dune that I thought was particular. But the social-political dynamics were very interesting, and the key here is the discussion on autism. Seems to me that that's really the main topic of this wonderful novel, and how autism, in his point of view, is a distortion of time itself. And I'm going to give you a quote that I think exemplifies this. It assumes a derangement in the sense of time in the autistic individual, so that the environment around him is so accelerated that he cannot cope with it. In fact, he is unable to perceive it properly, precisely as we would be if we faced a speeded up television program, so that objects whizzed by so fast as to be invisible, and sound was a gobbledygook, just extremely high-pitched mishmash. Now, this new theory would place the autistic child in a closed chamber where he faced a screen on which film sequences were projected slowed down. Do you see? Both sound and video slowed, that you and I would not be able to perceive motion or comprehend the sounds of human speech. So really cool perspective that a time differentiation between human beings could actually create mental illness. Autism being then a kind of schizophrenia that in a fascinating way distorts time. So even if it's just a very creative speculation, it's a beautiful way of looking at it, and a very interesting kind of side glance at a situation that has become, unfortunately, very prominent in the last couple of generations. Another idea explored in this particular novel is the concept of suicide itself, and from a naturalist perspective, it attempts to understand the whole tragic situation as somehow survival of the fittest. Obviously, this is a character speaking on this, but I understand the point of view. When I was younger, I used to see things in that way. I have always disliked and rejected the very notion of self-cancellation, but I think it oversimplifies the scenario. To just say, well, the weak should be taken out and the strong survive. It sounds appealing to some people, but it is not as easy as it seems. Eliminating yourself doesn't really fix anything, and a lot of people think that this is actually a form of a solution, which is absurd. You cannot solve something by canceling something. So it just becomes a horrific conclusion to actual possibilities. I always say it can always be worse, which means that things can always be better. And if you're aware of this, then it can never be as bad as it seems. There's always a glimmer of hope, and the hope is usually working on a solution, on resolving a problem. So I found it fascinating that he has a character actually treating something like this in such a fashion, but I can understand where it comes from because I used to see it that way when I was younger. I also love the notion in this particular novel where it kind of speaks of schizophrenia, usually as something dealing with the unconscious. In other words, the schizophrenic, when he deals with other human beings, he is aware of the unconscious and not necessarily on the surface level. And here it explores what would happen if someone like that dealt with a robot of some kind, a droid, because they wouldn't be able to connect at all with such a creature. The creature wouldn't be believable. And I wonder, how would this apply to AI, for example? Assuming that PKD is correct on this schizophrenia angle, does that mean that a schizophrenic dealing with AI would be unable to even communicate with it because it can't perceive a real unconscious on the being that he is communicating with? Let me give you another quote on this novel that I think will also grant you some feel for it. To escape from his dread vision, he retreats back to happier days. Days inside his mother's body, where there is no one else, no change, no time, no suffering. The womb life. He directs himself there to the only happiness he has ever known. Mister, he refuses to leave that dear spot. And that actually reminded me of Giger, the artist, because he was obsessed with creating actually these kinds of womb-like structures. A desire of return, something that Freud discusses in Jung himself. But is it really that comfortable? Is it really that pleasant? It reminds me of The Noble Savage, the fantasy that sparked a lot of the insanely naive notions that carry us to this day from the Enlightenment. Is it really that great in the womb? I remember reading in one of the Upanishads a description that is the complete opposite, describing it as a horror show, as a kind of uncomfortable and disturbing place to be. So, interesting how different cultures would have a different perspective on living in the womb. But again, it fits very nicely with this particular novel. The next novel in this collection is Dr. Bloodmoney, which is an apocalyptic dystopia type of work that has great sociological content. The work explains insanity and solipsism in a particular way, and when certain fantasies of power and dominance can become apparently true. So this is kind of what it's being explored there. Let me give you a quote as an example. What has happened is this, he decided. They were developing their arrangements to injure me, but they hadn't counted on my ability, which in me seems to lie partly in the subconscious. I have only a dubious control over it. It emanates from suprapersonal levels, what Jung would call the collective unconscious. They didn't take into account the almost limitless potency of my reactive psychic energy, and now it's flowed back out at them in response to their arrangements. I didn't will it to. It simply followed a psychic law of stimulus and response, but I must take moral responsibility for it anyhow, because it is I, the greater I, the self, which transcends the conscious ego. I must wrestle with it. Now that it's done, its work contra the others. I love that quote because it's completely insane, but as you will see in the novel, maybe he's not as crazy as he thinks. This novel in particular has a really cool concept of a live broadcaster stuck in a satellite, kind of observing the decline of civilization itself, kind of stuck there and constantly engaging people in that way. It reminded me of like the 1930s feel of the radio days, but in a futuristic kind of dystopian way. A very cool concept. The next novel is called Now Wait for Last Year, which is not only one of my favorites in the book, but I think it's one of my favorites of all time. And at the same time, it was a very annoyingly strange book to read because at first I was a little lost as I went through the novel because I was trying to keep up with the time dynamics of the novel. But once you fall into place, everything falls in perfectly, which is another aspect of the genius of this particular novel. The amount of concepts dealt with in this work are just mind-blowing, basically. Drugs, time as a concept itself, geopolitics, and even the very notion of love and loyalty, because he actually goes into the notion that the greatest hate can only come from the greatest love, because it's true intimacy. It's a beautiful idea, and he really goes into it in a way that I think it's masterful. Let me give you another quote that I think will give you a feel for it. The orchestra isn't there. The original sound has departed. The hall in which it was recorded is now silent. All you possess is 1,200 feet of iron oxide tape that's been magnetized in a specific pattern. It's an illusion just like this, only this is complete. QED, he thought. He walked on then towards the stairs. We live with illusion daily, he reflected. When the first bard rattled off the first epic of a sometime battle, illusion entered our lives. The Iliad is as much a fake as those robot children trading postage stamps on the porch of the building. Humans have always striven to retain the past, to keep it convincing. There's nothing wicked in that. Without it, we have no continuity. We have only the moment. And deprived of the past, the moment, the present, has little meaning, if any. And that's such a spectacular conception to present, right? Because what is real and what isn't is in a lot of ways related not only to perception, but is related to the medium of communication that we're using. When I read books on history, it becomes real in that moment to me. And that's when I come to the conclusion that whatever I'm reading in that book has had an actual impact on me, on my family. But I lived many years of my life without being aware of it. So is awareness the one that makes it true, or is it true irrespective of my awareness? And of course, I am inclined towards objective reality, so therefore I believe that it was always true. I was simply unaware of the fact that these things were impacting me. But in some ways, it is also subjective, because the moment I become aware of that fact, it changes my perception, and therefore it actually changes how I behave. And from that point forward, I am behaving in a coherent fashion with my new knowledge. And therefore, being aware of something will also impact the future. So both things can be simultaneously one and different, as it's called in some schools of Vedanta, Bheda Abheda, oneness and difference simultaneously. Now, this work also explores moral responsibility, how we ignore or forget what we have done that is evil, because if we would keep track of it constantly, we would be unable to exist. And this is another great moral conundrum, a great moral question. How important is it that we acknowledge our sins, we acknowledge our wrongdoings, and how important is it that we do not? Because sometimes we have to let go, that we have to move on. And all moral philosophers have contended with this. As a matter of fact, even in Catholic theology, I remember as a kid, they used to say that if you confessed the sin and you kept dwelling on it, that became a sin itself, the dwelling on. Because the confession was part of a letting go machination. Once you abandon the sin, you confessed it and you move on, you're supposed to just let it go. If you keep harping on it, you're actually committing a sin of believing that God did not forgive you. Even if you don't believe in this, it's still a fascinating point of view. It's a combination, right? You admit, you acknowledge, but then you move on. A very healthy perspective, I believe. The next novel is Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said, which blends dystopia with Dick's favorite topic, which is identity. Who are we, especially when we have built a persona around us, when we have created a fake character that encompasses our very being. And we do this all the time, but the question is, who are we? And the way he connects the dots here is with grief. Grief is the core element in this novel, I think. And I'm going to give you a quote as an explanation. Grief causes you to leave yourself. You step outside your narrow little pelt, and you can't feel grief unless you've had love before it. Grief is the final outcome of love because it's love lost. You do understand. I know you do. But you just don't want to think about it. It's the cycle of love completed. To love, to lose, to feel grief, to leave, and then to love again. Jason, grief is awareness that you will have to be alone. And there is nothing beyond that because being alone is the ultimate final destiny of each individual living creature. That's what death is, the great loneliness. Again, great philosophical insight and a realism that is crucial for human beings to consider. Now, of course, if you do believe in life after death, then there's really no loneliness no matter what you do. In other words, you can't escape the fact that you come from a context and you die into a context. So there's a pessimism there that I find very appealing, but there should be a little bit more perspective on it anyway. But grief and love are indeed related. The deepest love that we have are the ones that we have the greater capacity for grief. And that is beautiful to consider, but simultaneously tragic. And in my opinion, this is exactly the reason why most human beings search for something higher, because this dichotomy is so powerful, it becomes almost incomprehensible, and we search an answer for a why, the telos of this particular experience. And again, the other topic would be, what is reality in a fake world? If we create an entire world of celebrities and nonsense and manipulation, then what is real at the end of the day? Can we even identify what is real? That's a great question. And I think a lot of times we cannot. And that's why we have to find a higher cause, a higher purpose, because if we stick to what we see every day and what we're forced to do and how we are forced to act, etc., then we're living legitimately in a fake world, and therefore identity itself is fake. This is why the modern world is obsessed with the manufacturing of identities, and that's why everyone is switching identities and saying, I was born like this, but I'm really like that, because they're obsessed with self-hatred and self-denial. They have no clue who they are, so they might as well just switch it up and pick whatever. It has become a cereal that you shop for, that you pick and you just wear. And it really destroys true diversity, and it really destroys true identity. And it's a horrific situation that we have to contend with, for sure. And of course, this particular novel, it mixes all the insanity of a police state with notions of achievement, how enhanced humans could engage with other humans that are not enhanced. In other words, can you be really truly enhanced in a world of fake identities anyway? Because what happens in this particular novel is that those that are enhanced humans pretend not to be, and those that are not pretend to be enhanced. So at some point it becomes self-canceling and ridiculous. Finally, we get to the last novel in the collection, A Scanner Darkly. This is a beautifully tragic work, and it's really a work about drugs as a gateway to pure insanity and the shattering of the self itself. And I've always been aggressively anti-drugs, straight edge, as we were called many years back. And this is primarily the reason, because to me, identity shattering is the worst thing that can happen to a human being. If you lose even the possibility of understanding yourself, you have become a nothing, and therefore a vessel to be filled with whatever the people in power want to fill in, to manipulate. And that doesn't mean that if you're sober, you cannot be manipulated. Of course, that would be fallacious. But what I'm saying is that you're giving them an extra leg up if you become shattered as a human being. And this novel really paints a grim picture of what happens when you fall into the world of drug addiction, psychedelics, etc. And let me give you a quote that exemplifies this. I believe with Wiggin that each of us has two minds in one person. There is a host of detail to be marshaled in this case, but we must eventually confront directly the principal resistance of the Wiggin view. That is, the subjective feeling possessed by each of us that we are one. This inner conviction of oneness is the most cherished opinion of Western man. Now that is what some people think is the positive of psychedelics, right? That when people take psychedelics, they view the universe as a single reality, oneness, non-differentiation, advaita, non-dualistic. But the question he's asking is, who are we in that context? And that creates the problem of the schizophrenic, the shattering of identity. Because you can't be part of something and at the same time retain your own reality, your own self. But people usually use the drug to try to perceive the oneness, but they get lost in the oneness and therefore they get lost in general. So how many fragments of life are we? If we cut our moments into sections, right? If we take our time and our lives and we just cut it into little tiny sections, are we really in any of them? And then the next question, how can God judge the fullness within the fragments when we can't even apprehend all the fragments? We can't really see the fullness of anything. We only catch a few of the fragments, even though we live in all of them. So the question is, can you really be judged on a piece of a puzzle? It's a great philosophical question. Here's another quote that I think goes into that point. I think really there is nothing more terrible than the sacrifice of someone or something, a living thing, without its ever knowing. If it knew, if it understood and volunteered, but, she gestured, he doesn't know. He never did know. He didn't volunteer. In this quote, to me, it's fascinating because it's actually a contradiction from how he ends the novel in a letter that he writes at the end of this novel, dedicating it to all the friends and people that got lost in drugs and died. Because there he argues that this was a choice. A choice was made and the consequences are just too hard. But in this quote, the character is arguing that there was never a choice from the beginning. Because for you to make a true choice, you have to know all the consequences, or at least partial. And this is discussed in ethics. Now, human beings, we don't know all the consequences of things, but we can learn from others and apply them to ourselves. But hyper-individualism doesn't allow us to learn from others, because hyper-individualism teaches that you can learn only from your own experience, which means that you're making a decision to become a drug addict on your own, thinking that somehow the rules apply differently to you. If you were able to see the world in a collective way, collective consciousness, that other people's experiences apply to you, and you take that in a healthy way, then you would be warned against doing certain things. So if there's no choice, then you are a slave. And that is really the key of this novel to me. It's a beautifully tragic novel. And it's difficult for me. Some of these novels, I cannot relate to that lifestyle, cannot relate to that consciousness. But PKD is a genius, and therefore he's able to communicate this in a way that I can comprehend it and can navigate. And I remember years ago, I was told by a professional that when you put a trap for a rat and the rat dies, it leaves a chemical smell, a scent, for other rats to stay away from that area because he died in that spot. He's warning his community. Now, if a rat comes along and says, I don't care about that smell or that rat because that's his experience and I have my own and I'm not going to be trapped by the choices of others, I am my own person, next thing you know, he's dead too. That's how ridiculous that argument is and how problematic. Hyper-individualism has murdered thousands upon thousands of people because they have stupidly fallen into the trap of believing that they're true individuals. True individuals meaning autonomous, supernatural beings that have no connection to any other reality, no context. Yes, we exist as parts of a whole, and we're not the whole 100%, we're not the part 100%. We're a combination. And if we forget this, we suffer. And I think this novel exemplifies that in a beautiful way, but it has a lot of funny stuff in there as well. So very enjoyable. I highly suggest it if you haven't already. If you have, drop in the comments your favorite things of any of these novels, actually. So all in all, some of these novels will be tough to read, either because their topic is heavy or the plot structure is unconventional. And some of the states of mind portrayed are a little strange, but I still think Philip K. Dick should be read by almost all educated people. Because if you cannot enter into this consciousness, I don't think you can understand the worst and the best of human beings. So as an author, one of my favorites, I highly recommend it. So get all the novels, get individual novels, however you want to do it. Hopefully you enjoyed this review. It was a little bit longer because of the amount of novels in there, but please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.